Okay, then let's get started. We're going to speak about high places. Now, throughout the Old Testament, there are references to high places. Now, God has a thing against high places because have I got it? Yeah, sorry, no, I'm getting there. High places were places of worship that had been around for probably thousands of years. When Israel entered the Promised Land, Canaan, this was rife. There were places of worship. They called high places because they were often, but not always, on hills or mountains. They created high structures just as a really symbolic of getting closer to their God. So high and height was part of this. And it was typically an altar and an ashram or some kind of a raised structure, but it wasn't limited to mountaintops or high grounds. And interestingly, until the temple was built, the Israelites mainly worshipped Yahweh at a local center of worship. Okay, and that wasn't condemned by God, but once the temple had been built, God made it clear that you worship me only at this place. So any other sort of local altars and things that the Israelites had formed, when the temple was built, God said, no, this is where my presence is. All these other things you've got to give up, because there's lots of syncretism, etc., and you've got to give up the ways of the Canaanites. And this became a litmus test for Israel's morality. And it was a temptation, it was a struggle, it was a sin that they just weren't able to shake off. So we read about high places throughout Kings. I'm not going to go through all the details. These aren't all of them, under King Asa, Jehoshaphat, Jehoash, Amaziah, Azariah, Jotham, all of them, and others. And what we read here in 2 Kings 17, 2 Kings 17 is a chapter that describes the exile of the northern kingdom. Great chapter. This is where the author explains why God has done what he has done in a lot of detail. The message would have been very clear that, what has happened is not because God is not faithful, but it's because we have been unfaithful. Okay, so it's a great sort of summary. And in verse 9 to 11, we read, and the people of Israel did secretly against the Lord their God things that were not right. They built for themselves high places in all their towns, from watchtower to fortified city. They set up for themselves pillars and ashram on every high hill and under every green tree. And there they made offerings on all the high places, as the nations did, whom the Lord carried away before them. And they did wicked things, provoking the Lord to anger. So one of the reasons why God was angry and disciplined and judged his people through the exile was because they just didn't give up these worship practices, that were common amongst or in the nations around them. Sorry, I meant to show you this. So this is a stand. They call it a stand, kind of a little pole. It's about 1 meter high. It was found at Tanakh, which was a city, ancient city. I don't think it's around anymore in Israel. It goes back to the 9th or 10th century. There's a lot of evidence and information that comes through archaeology. You guys can see that, eh? Okay, cool. And this is really interesting. It was preserved in a disused well, apparently. And I don't know if it was planned, if it was just by luck, but the type of soil and clay around it actually preserved it very well. Okay, so this is an old item. And they've studied this, and you can see the different layers. And all of these little images are images of different gods that were common. And some archaeologists and theologians who have studied this believe that Yahweh is actually represented here as well, which would indicate what the problem was. People were worshiping at places like this, like Yahweh became one of many gods. And they started sort of hedging their bets the way all the other nations did. So it's not proven, but certainly strong suggestions of syncretism at in a very specific way, using places like this to actually worship God. Deuteronomy 12 again, as I said, strong themes of Deuteronomy, the law, they come through, and the Deuteronomy 12 verse 2 to 3. God makes it clear, you shall surely destroy all the places where the nations whom you shall dispossess, serve their gods on the high mountains, on the hills, blah, blah. You'll tear down the altars, chop down the carved image. You shall not worship the Lord your God in that way. But you shall seek the place that the Lord your God will choose out of all your tribes to put his name and make his habitation there. There you shall go, and there you shall bring your burnt offerings and your sacrifice. A reference to the temple that Solomon would build. Okay, now King Asa, what an interesting guy. So this is what we read in 1 Kings 15. Asa did what was right in the eyes of the Lord, as David his father had done. Okay, remember that reference? The guy's a good king. He imitated David. He put away the male cult prostitutes out of the land and removed all the idols that his fathers had made, but the high places were not taken away. Nevertheless, the heart of Asa was wholly true to the Lord all his days. And he brought into the house of the Lord the sacred gifts of the Father and his own sacred gifts, silver and gold and vessels. Okay, the question then is, how can he be referred to as being wholly true to God, yet he still allowed the high places? I mean, he did some good things here, right? He put away the cult prostitutes, removed all the idols. He brought into the house of the Lord is sacrificial, in terms of giving to God, but the high places were not taken away. Yet the writer says his heart was wholly true to the Lord. Messy, right? And especially when we read 2 Chronicles. Now, Kings and Chronicles are similar, but they're also different. Chronicles is also a historical narrative. It is the story of the southern kingdom in particular. And this is what we read in 2 Chronicles. So it's good to sort of, cross-check. In 2 Chronicles 14, we read, and Asa did what was right, good and right in the eyes of the Lord his God. He took away the foreign altars and the high places, and broke down the pillars and cut down the Asherim, and commanded Judah to seek the Lord, the God of their fathers, and to keep the law and the commandments. He also took out of all the cities of Judah the high places and the incense altars, and the kingdom had rest under him. So did or didn't King Asa remove the high places? King said he didn't, Chronicles said he did. So how do you cope with that? And interestingly, people who are very critical of the Bible use passages like that to show that the Bible's inconsistent. It contradicts themselves. And it's not like it's not gonna sort of throw my faith. I don't know about you, but it does seem like a contradiction. But that's where we got to understand the big picture. Why these books were written? What was the purpose? Kings and Chronicles were written at different times for very different reasons. Chronicles was written to the Israelites, southern kingdom, after their return to Judah after the Babylonian exile. Okay, so this is more recent, and it was written for a very different reason. Remember, Kings was written to encourage the exiles, the northern kingdom exiles in Assyria, to take responsibility. Like this, it wasn't God, it was your fault. You were warned. God is faithful. You, God's people, haven't been faithful. So he tended to highlight the negative things that supported that purpose. Get that? Chronicles, on the other hand, was written to the exiles after their return to Judah to encourage them. Okay, different message. And there is something here that can bring the two, two recounts of this together. You guys see what it is? Maybe it's a bit of a tough question. He says he took away the foreign altars and the high places, but then verse 5, he also took out of all the cities of Judah the high places and the incense altars. Now, in those days, these things were so prevalent that the kings apparently used to focus on the cities, but it was very difficult to look in every little valley and under every tree, and in every little, hidden away place to find these things which were pretty small. So it seems like King Asa was very deliberate in going to the cities and removing all the high places. Good king. But the author of Kings is saying that under Asa, there were still high places. You see, it's not contradictory. And we must remember that the scriptures are written by men. Okay, and we have biases. And I know that, we certainly read that the scriptures were inspired by God. The writing of the scriptures was led by the Holy Spirit. But the purpose of the authors is still the purpose of the authors. So they are going to be selective in what they record. Make sense? Okay, so don't get thrown when you see that sort of thing. You study it out, but understand when it was written, who it was written to, why it was written. And usually that explains the contradiction. Syncretism. We've mentioned syncretism quite a lot. There's a difference between syncretism and apostasy. I mean to ask you this. I didn't want to show it. But apostasy is the complete abandonment of God, shifting your loyalty completely, giving up on God, shifting allegiance and a loyalty to another master, another God. And in these times, it was especially by worshiping Baal, which peaked under King Ahab. Syncretism is the blending of beliefs, worshiping God and other gods. So my question is, what is the greatest threat to Christianity nowadays, do you think? Syncretism, gradual sort of shifts away from God. So for a while at least, we're worshiping God, but we are starting to also get influenced and trusting in other things. Okay?
Yeah, both.
Both.
I think the evil thing.
Yeah.
But I think both are equally,
Threat,
both are rife right now, apostasy in terms of complete abandonment of God and then worshiping self or worshiping money or worshiping anything else except God, or just not worshiping anything. But then by definition, worshiping your own intellect, I guess, thinking that nothing else exists.
Right.
Yeah, and I think syncretism is a big thing right now within campus ministries. Just thinking that
universalism.
Universalism and the whole the secret manifestation and all this stuff is God in other ways, and so believing all these things kind of lead to God. So.
Right. Yeah. Okay. I emphasized the threat to Christianity, almost like existing Christians, and maybe let me put it this way: what's more dangerous to the wearer or the person, a watch that loses a minute a day or a watch that loses an hour a day? What's more dangerous to wear, a watch that loses a minute a day or a watch that loses an hour a day? Yeah, because you don't notice it. If your watch loses an hour a day, within a couple of days, you're going to pick it up, right? There's something not right about it. It's not really 7 o'clock. I haven't had enough sleep. It's 5 o'clock. But if you lose a minute a day, you don't notice it. So it's that gradual creep. I think that's what Jake mentioned, and I think you as well. Yeah, and I think that the culture of the world doesn't change overnight. It's very, very gradual. And to me, the danger is that we start to be influenced by all these other things, but we still go to church, we're still disciples. And we don't want to judge if people are not disciples or not, but we start to embrace other worldviews. Maybe God does also work through Islam and Hindi and New Age movements, and kind of what these are saying seems to have a little ring of truth in it. but that's the danger, the creep. It's the minute a day that you're losing. And yeah, so I think we just need to be super careful. Now, there's a great example. Oh, I love this story. King Ahaz. Ahaz, I can't remember which king he. Okay, Ahaz is the king in the southern kingdom who was in power when the northern kingdom went into exile. That's right. Okay, so it's around about 720 BC. Israel and Syria were in an alliance to attack Judah. Okay, King Ahaz is in Judah. So he approaches the king of Assyria. Assyria is like the big brother, the big guy who's more powerful than Syria. Syria was between the northern kingdom and Assyria, Mesopotamia. Remember the map? Okay, so he goes straight to the big guy and says, "Man, I need some help here. Okay, these guys are going to invade me." And he pays him with silver and gold from the temple. Great. How did God feel about that? It's all about money. Okay, so he bought him, and then Assyria attacked Damascus, which is in Samaria, and he kills the king of Syria. Ahaz then pays tribute to the Assyrian king. He goes to Damascus. Can't remember the name of the king. Thanks so much, awesome. They talk about future partnerships, whatever. And then he sees in Damascus an altar that he likes, that the king of Assyria has brought with him. Okay, brought his God with him. Now we're going to give thanks to God. We're going to sacrifice to him. So this is a Judean king in Judea, Ahaz. He likes this altar so much, he sends instructions to his priest in Jerusalem to build an altar just like this. He gives him the dimensions, and then he gets back to Jerusalem. And this is what happens. When the king came from Damascus back to Jerusalem, this is Ahaz. King viewed the altar. This is the Assyrian altar. Then the king drew near to the altar and went up to it, and burned his burnt offerings and his grain offerings, and poured his drink offering and threw the blood of his peace offerings on the altar. So he's now worshiping on the Assyrian altar. And the bronze altar, which is God's altar, that was before the Lord, he removed from the front of the house, from the place between the altar and the house of the Lord, put it on the north side. Now, this is a couple of pictures of the layout. That's in this picture on the left there where the smoke is, that's the Lord's altar. And this is from the other angle in this picture, the Lord's altar, God's altar, as they constructed it in a very specific way according to a plan. That's in the right there. And on the left here, you have the bronze basin. So the process would be that the priest would make sacrifices on the altar. The high priest who entered into the temple, and the other priests that did odds and ends, the high priest that went into the most holy of holies, would pretty much get baptized in this big bath, okay, for purification before he could enter into the presence of God. This is a picture of baptism, by the way. That's a picture of salvation, that we don't, our sacrificial altar, our sacrifice, our high priest is Jesus. Okay, we don't have to do this, but you accept that Jesus has died for us, he's raised to new life, and in Christ, we participate in his death, burial, and resurrection. So that's the altar. Baptism is the bronze bath, and then entering to the presence of God, having our sins forgiven. That's just amazing how God has designed all this stuff. But anyway, so yeah, we have King Ahaz comes home and he moves God's altar out of the way. Getting a bit too busy in the courtyard. Yeah, let's just sort of shift that out the way. And then the Syrian altar is here. But this is what he says. And King Ahaz commanded Uriah the priest, saying, on the great altar, which now is the Syrian altar to him, that's the great altar, burn the morning burnt offerings and the evening grain offering and the king's burnt offering and his grain offering, all his offerings, with the burnt offering of all the people of the land and their grain offerings and their drink offerings, and throw on it all the blood of the burnt offering and the blood of the sacrifice. But here's the thing, he says, but the bronze altar, God's altar, shall be for me to inquire by. So he says, man, we'll go through the daily sacrifices, but when I'm really stuck, when I really need some advice, I'll consult God. Is that a picture of our tendencies? You know, are there things that we worship, you know, that we listen to? And I think our idols are much closer to us than we think. Our opinions, our emotions, our thoughts. Which voice do we listen to? And that's just my experience. Who do we get advice from? You know, but when we're really in a pickle, when we're really in a crisis, that's suddenly when we trust God again completely. So this is an amazing picture, isn't it, of our tendencies. Do you trust in God alone, or do we share him with other gods? Okay, only coming to him when we face a crisis. Awesome story, hey? Scary story, but very relevant. Okay, so part of why God really lost his patience with these guys eventually. Okay, this is Judah. Remember, he was faithful to them because his promises for David, but they still went into exile, brought them back, was this kind of behavior, sharing him. You know, God is a jealous God. You know, Exodus 34 verse 14. You shall worship no other God, for the Lord, whose name is jealous, is a jealous God. No one can serve two masters, Jesus speaking, for either he will hate the one and love the other, or he will be devoted to the one and despise the other. You cannot serve God and money. I always encourage people to replace money with what it is that tempts you. And, you know, in the church, yeah, there are exceptions, but I don't see too many disciples who full on worship money. I think there's some. So replace money with whatever it is. For me, you cannot serve God and your own opinions. For you, it might be something similar. You cannot serve God and your comfort. You cannot serve God and your pleasure. Okay, so we cannot serve God and other masters, other things that we would let master us. And 1 Corinthians 10, that's why Paul says, therefore, my beloved, flee from idolatry. Remember, it starts with a watch losing a minute a day. Before we know it, we are totally out of sync. Okay, it starts slowly. It's subtle. You know, these things creeping over time. Okay, I think you guys have discussed this with Raj already, so we won't dig into that more. But then the exile of Israel, as I said, that's in 2 Kings 17. The background here is that King Hoshea surrendered to King Shalmaneser of Syria. He became his vassal, but he went behind his back. We saw this earlier to, you know, Saul, the king of Egypt. Hoshea was jailed. Israel was invaded by Shalmaneser. After a 3-year siege, Samaria fell, 722. That's where the curse of cannibalism is seen. Probably other places too. The Israelites were led away to Assyria in chains. And then foreigners, the Assyrian strategy was actually very clever, cruel but clever. They were always concerned, or they had a concern that the nations that they conquered would regroup. So they would quickly send people from other nations, some of their own, some of the others, and send them into Samaria. They took some of the Samaritans, not all of them. They lived together, and over time there was interbreeding, for lack of a better word, etc. So they weakened, you know, the culture and the history, and the worldview and the religion. Clever but cruel, eh? Yeah. And talk about cruelty. That picture there is actually very kind, because if you study this out, they marched, you know, the exiles that they did take to Assyria, they marched them out chained together with fish hooks, big fish hooks, through their buttocks. I know you've been introduced to some horrible, you know, images today, but understand how cruel these people were. And we'll see later how God, speaking through his prophets, spoke against and judged Assyria for their behavior, okay, their cruelty and their arrogance. That was clever as a strategy, because you can imagine being chained together with a group of that. You stay together. You know, everybody's got to walk at the same pace. You carried each other, you moved, and there's no ways you try to run away. You absolutely walked in step. So that was what happened to Israel. Israel sitting in Assyria, you know, a generation later, when they read this, when this author was, when he wrote this, they looked at the scars, they looked, thought back the stories from their parents, and they thought, man, what's happened to God? Okay, so the author of Kings summarizes why everything has happened that has happened. Remember, this is a form of theodicy, in other words, justifying why God has acted the way he has. Verse 7, and all this occurred because the people of Israel had sinned against the Lord their God, who had brought them up out of the land of Egypt, from under the hand of Pharaoh, king of Egypt, and had feared other gods, and walked in the customs of the nations whom the Lord drove out before the people of Israel, and in the customs of the kings that the kings of Israel had practiced. Okay, so that's a good summary of why God sent his people into exile using the powerful yet super cruel Assyrians. All right, so God was faithful to his promises. It's that God's people weren't. So what sort of lessons we learn about the character of God from the book of Kings? And after this, we're going to move on to the prophets. One word, God is faithful. They'll get that one up. Faithful and God just, yep. Sorry? Jealous. Yeah, God's a jealous God. Holy, absolutely. A God set apart, he's different, without sin. Compassionate, yeah, definitely. Okay, all those things. I just came up with a list. He's faithful to his covenant promises, his sovereignty. Okay, God's sovereignty shows all over the Bible. He uses situations and people and powers to move his story forward. Now, God is faithful to his restoration project, and he will use whatever it takes to support his restoration project. His hatred of idolatry, the effect it has, his righteous anger, his blessings if he is obeyed, his patience, his use of prophets to warn his people, his discipline if his warnings are not heeded, and his willingness to forgive if we repent. All right. In the interest of time, we're not going to be able to do this. We had a break now with the technology. Can we keep going? Yeah. Okay, we got it. Otherwise, we're going to finish late. All right, so let's push. Question.
Quick question.
Yeah.
So, in 2 Kings 17, what we discussed just now, are we right in saying that was like the beginning of the end of Israel as a nation? Like,
yes.
They were never the same again.
Yes, Israel were never the same again. Correct, yeah. 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 Okay, quick question, sort of counter question. In the time of Jesus, we read a lot about the Samaritans. And what was the nature of the relationship between the Jews and the Samaritans?
Not good.
Not good. Okay. The Samaritans arose from what we've been speaking about. The Samaritans came out of the exile and the interbreeding, for lack of a better word. It sounds horrible, but for the strategy of the Assyrians to weaken the northern kingdom of Israel, and they would have done this to the southern kingdom as well. They weakened it genetically. So by the time Jesus came, they were regarded as a mixed race, a half-breed. They worshipped in all sorts of different ways. They worshipped God, but they worshipped him in kind of a different way, and there was a lot of syncretism. But obviously you had the seekers like the Samaritan woman at the well, and her confusion sort of showed, where do we worship God on this mountain, that mountain? And that's when Jesus says, things are different now. We don't worship God on any mountain. Right? Okay, so the Samaritan nation and the hostilities from both sides and the lack of trust from both sides arose out of this exile. Okay. Cool. Okay, Elijah and Elisha, they're spoken about in Kings. These are what you call, fancy word, non-canonical prophets. In other words, important prophets who don't have books written about them. There isn't a book of Elijah or Elisha, yet they are amazing prophets. I love all the prophets, by the way. We'll get to them. But what's the role of a prophet and how do you test a true prophet? This is in Deuteronomy 18, verse 18 first. I will raise up for them a prophet like you from among your brothers, and I will put my words in his mouth, and he shall speak to them all that I command you. You may know this scripture. This is God speaking to Moses. And how can we interpret this? I will raise up from them a prophet like you from among their brothers. I'll raise up from them a prophet like you from among their brothers. This is the people of Israel. Yeah. Now, once again, this, I believe, the way we should read this is more immediate than just Jesus. Certainly, Jesus is a prophet like Moses, but he's telling Moses that I'm going to raise up prophets. And there were a lot of prophets between Moses and Jesus, okay? And I'll put my words in his mouth so that he shall speak to them all that I command him. A prophet is a spokesperson of God. Prophets were into forth-telling as much as foretelling. Have you heard those words?
Yeah.
Forth-telling is calling people out, repent. This is the current problem. This is what you need to do. And there was a lot more forth-telling than foretelling. But they certainly also spoke about the future, which is foretelling. But the future was normally the immediate future, that the people that they were speaking to would have experienced if they didn't repent.
Yeah.
So important how we read prophecy. Okay, we've got to be careful we don't read into prophecy. Every prophet's about Jesus or about the kingdom. Okay, certainly there are prophecies about Jesus and about the church and about the kingdom, but it was much more practical and useful for the audience at the time. Okay, they wouldn't have understood that a lot of the prophecies were about Jesus, but they certainly understood what they were going for through, and they understood the warnings.
Yeah.
Okay, so just remember that. And then how do we know if a prophet is a true prophet or a false prophet? Verse 21, and if you say in your heart, how may we know the word that the Lord has not spoken? When a prophet speaks in the name of the Lord, if the word does not come to pass, if it does not come true, that is a word that the Lord has not spoken. The prophet has spoken it presumptuously. You need not be afraid of him. Okay, so true prophets, and we have obviously the benefit of hindsight and the scriptures. True prophets, what they prophesied came true. Okay, real prophets from God. There were plenty of false prophets. Yes.
That's a small question. Does that then mean that Jonah is a false prophet?
Was Jonah a real person even? We'll get there.
And right, let's move on.
Yeah. No, Jonah only said one sentence prophecy, and he didn't even mention God in it. So I don't think there's enough.
Okay.
But we'll get there. We'll talk about Jonah's a real interesting character. Okay. Messy, that one. Okay, so the prophets, they use different methods, all sorts of weird and wonderful ways: metaphors, parables, symbolic actions, everyday examples, illustrations, parody, puns, even music, visual aids, acting things out, etc. And so this is where a lot of your fired up preachers get this from, But illustrations are helpful. I mean, you guys know this. When people have studied the Bible with you, when they've told you stories, when they've shared their life stories. I do that a lot nowadays, and I love it. When I study with people, whatever's on the table, I'm going to turn into a battleground or something. That's the way we should speak about God, It's just tell your stories. It's like if you see something, it's like that car you see there. It's just make it real. That's how people remember. And that's how the prophets, they use, Jesus spoke in parables, he used everyday examples. I think the way we bring the message across is important, not just the truth of the Bible, but share stories, have illustrations. Jesus going to the cross and feeling the separation from God. I tell the story of, quick one, I'm aware of time. I remember gardening when my kids were young. I had a lot more time. I loved gardening. My daughter was with me. We didn't have a wall, and she was walking towards the road. And I just had this thought that imagine if a car came and there were 3 or 4 really nasty guys in this car, and they grabbed my daughter and went driving away with her. And I actually had a nightmare over this for a while. And I thought, I've got to watch my daughter more carefully. And then I tell the story that imagine if my daughter turns around and she looks at me through the window and she says, Dad, help me. And I turn my back on her. You know, and that's effectively what happened on the cross. You know, would I be big enough? If I knew that that event, my daughter being abducted, would save the world, would I let her be abducted? I don't think so. There's stuff like that. Tell stories. That's what people relate to. Okay, so common themes that from the prophets over and over again: do not compromise with idolatry, resist the lure of the world, turn back to the law of God. Faith and ethics are inseparable. We're going to get there specifically today. Take care of the underprivileged. There is hope for the repentant, but doom for the unrepentant. They never spun their revelations from God. They didn't water down the truth. I always say that as disciples, we are called to be the salt of the earth, not the sugar of the earth. You hear what I'm saying? Certainly we're kind and what have you, but salt cuts, you know. Salt is anus sometimes when there's a sore, which is what they use salt for as antibiotics. You know, that's an aside. So they spoke the word of God as God revealed it to them. They didn't water it down. Importantly, as I said, the messages generally pertain to the immediate situation or the immediate future. True prophets are always outnumbered by false prophets in the Bible. Okay, plenty false prophets. True nowadays? Possibly. And I love this quote from a book called The Prophets by Rabbi Abraham Heschel. The prophet hates the approximate. He shuns the middle of the road. Man must live on the summit to avoid the abyss. That's what they believe. There's nothing to hold on to except God. Carried away by the challenge and the demand to straighten out man's ways, the prophet is strange. He's one-sided. He is an unbearable extremist. The prophet disdains those for whom God's presence is comfort and security. To him, it is a challenge and it's an incessant demand. God is compassion, but not compromise. Justice, though not harshness. The prophet's word is a scream in the night. While the world is at ease and asleep, the prophet feels the blast from heaven. And we see that in Elijah and Elisha and these other prophets. These are extreme guys, man. They're unbearable extremists. It's cool. Okay, let's look at some now. So the prophets to the north, we're going to go through very quickly today. Okay, now I've taken just the kings of Israel. I'm going down to, 722 exile. Elijah and Elisha. God sent Elijah during the time of King Ahab. You know, the evil of evil kings who married Jezebel. I don't think we could find a more evil partnership and marriage than that. Elijah prophesied for about that time, 20 odd years, followed by Elisha, who prophesied for a little bit longer, and then Amos and Hosea we'll look at. And then, with a bit of luck, we're going to get to Jonah and Nahum, who prophesied to Assyria before and after the exile, which is super exciting. And Isaiah in the south prophesied just between those. Okay, so you check how this comes together. All right, so Elijah, let's start with him. His name means my God is Yahweh. That was Elijah. He was the greatest of all the prophets. Remember the transfiguration? Moses represented the law. Elijah represented the prophets. He had a distinctive style of dress. He dressed in hair. I don't know if it was human hair or goat's hair like John the Baptist, but he had garments of hair and with a leather belt around his waist. Echoes there for pointing forward to John the Baptist. Anyway, so God sends a severe drought and famine to Samaria. He sends Elijah into the wilderness and uses ravens to feed him. A couple of stories that you will remember. And after 3 years, Elijah returns and confronts Ahab, who had married Jezebel, as I said, to forge the alliance with Sidon. So just to show you the map, that purple there is Phoenicia. Sidon is close to where those arrows are. Now, Phoenicia also expanded a little bit, but they were generally in a good position. People needed them. You know, we were the sailors. We knew how to bring trade in here. Mess with us, you're going to chop your own foot off kind of thing. So they were pretty okay. You know, controlling that strip, you know, strategically, that's an important strip. You know, supplying into Assyria and Assyria, Babylon, etc. Ahaz certainly saw benefit in forging this alliance, formalizing it through marrying Jezebel, who was a princess from Sidon. But then we read this: there was none who sold himself to do what was evil in the sight of the Lord like Ahab, whom Jezebel, his wife, incited. Sorry, I'm losing it on my screen. I hope I read that right. Okay, so the two of them were, it's fair to say, I think, a partnership created in hell. Is that a bit harsh? Prophet, to say it as it is. Okay, then Elijah and the prophets of Baal. All right, so God sends Elijah to confront Ahab. Ahab sees Elijah coming and he says, "Is it you, you troubler of Israel?" It's quite rich coming from Ahab. Eh? I mean, who's of Israel here? And he answered, "I've not troubled Israel, but you have, and your father's house, because you have abandoned the commandments of the Lord and followed the Baals." And then he gives them the challenge, the showdown on Mount Carmel. "Therefore send and gather all Israel to me, and the 450 prophets of Baal, the 400 prophets of Asherah, who eat at Jezebel's table." Okay, you guys probably know how the story goes. Okay, two animals, cut them up, put them on your altar. I'll put mine on mine. You pray to Baal for him to send fire from the sky and set it alight. The guys carry on all day. They chant, they go crazy, they cut themselves, which was a way to apparently impress and get the attention of their gods. Baal didn't answer. And then Elisha came, but he first had lots and lots of water put on the offering, and God just sent fire down and burnt up the offering. It's pretty impressive. Huh? Yeah. And when all the people saw it, they fell on their faces and said, "The Lord, he is God. The Lord, he is God." Okay, these are Israelites, right? There's he invited a lot of the Israelites. They clearly saw the truth here. Yeah. I mean, who do you? Baal God, who's the true God? And then Elijah said to them, "Seize the prophets of Baal, let none of them escape." They seized them. Elijah brought them down to the brook Kishon, slaughtered them there. And Elijah said to Ahab, "Go up, eat and drink, for there's a sound of the rushing of rain." This is awesome. You know the story, he prayed, whatever, so many times, saw a little cloud and the rain came. Before this, you saw that God had sent a drought. Now, Baal, I can't remember the words that Raj used, but he was the god of weather, storms, rain, provision. And that would have included apparently things like fire and lightning. So in this little episode, what was the point? You see how God doesn't randomly choose rain and fire. You know, your God that you think controls these things, rain and fire, I control them. Okay, so a powerful lesson for Israel. Ahab, of course, didn't buy it. Jezebel certainly didn't. So Ahab went to tell Jezebel all that had happened, how he'd killed all the prophets by the sword. Jezebel sends a message to Elijah saying, "So may the gods do to me, and more so, if I do not make your life as the life of the many, as one of them by this time." Speaking about the prophecies destroyed, "by this time tomorrow." And then one of the most surprising lines in the Bible to me. "Then he was afraid and he ran for his life." I mean, Elijah, this is a crazy guy, you know, I mean, afraid. "He himself went to a day's journey into the wilderness, came and sat down under a broom tree, and he asked that he might die, saying, 'It is enough now, O Lord, take away my life, for I'm no better than my fathers.'" Interesting, we're having thunder when we're talking about this, eh? Rain and thunder. Okay. Yeah, where's the fire? It's stormy here, those of you on Zoom. We're just saying it's just a coincidence that God's sending like super thunderstorm, destructive. Okay, so what is happening here? So may God sent him to Mount Sinai, Horeb. No surprises. This is where God spoke to his people on the mountain. He sent a strong wind, an earthquake, and a fire. And these elements were present when God gave the law. He's reminding him, right? He's talking to him. But this time he was not in any of them. What was he in? What did he come as, you guys remember? A whisper. And after the fire, the sound of a low whisper. And when Elijah heard it, he wrapped his face in his cloth and went out and stood at the entrance of the cave. And behold, there came a voice to him and said, what are you doing here, Elijah? Now, interestingly, apparently I'm not a Hebrew scholar, but if you look into the Hebrew of this sound of a low whisper, it's kind of, it literally means the sound of silence. But the translators find it hard to say that, where silence doesn't have a sound. Whether it was a low whisper or silence, but God speaks. He speaks in the silence, doesn't he? Elijah was just a man. Now, we've seen this in ministry. I mean, you guys are potentially future ministers where ministers do not take time out to look after themselves. Okay. So yeah, he has a breakdown. It's things are, yeah, he's had some kind of a breakdown. It's just got too much. Have you ever felt like that? Like, man, life is so busy, crazy. Feel I need to take some time out, but I can't. Go to work. There's too much to do. It happens in business. It happens in ministry. So God is God, and He knew exactly how He needed to reach Elijah. This wasn't the time for thunder and storm. This is, man, I'm here. I'm always here. It's okay. We're gonna get through this. Interestingly, though, how did God, in a sense, heal Elijah? What followed immediately after this? What did God do? Did He tell Elijah? Look, I'm not saying He always does this, but He sent him back. Obviously it was a good rest, but it was, man, there's still work for you to do. You go back, and He told him specifically to go and do something. So I think it's important that God understands where we're at, comes alongside, gets us whole again and healing, but then sends us back, Okay, there we go. Psalm 46:10, be still and know that I am the Lord. Psalm 141, O Lord, my heart is not lifted up, my eyes are not raised too high. I do not occupy myself with things too great or too marvelous for me, for I've calmed and quieted my soul. Like a weaned child with its mother, like a weaned child is my soul within me. Silence is one of the spiritual disciplines. I don't know about you, but let me speak for me. I find this very, very hard. To be still and silent is tough for me. But recently, there's been a bit of a breakthrough. Our leaders are going through a program called Emotionally Healthy Spirituality by Pete Scazzero, you might know about it. A couple of the churches in the States have done it, about it, yeah. And it is super helpful. I start every morning, silent breathing, 2 minutes of just breathing in, breathing out. And I've learned to just shut off completely and just imagine God with me. I think of a few things like when I breathe in, I imagine breathing in the Spirit. When I breathe out, I imagine breathing out myself, And I think of all the contrast, patience and impatience. And 2 minutes in the morning, 2 minutes in the evening. It's a small thing, but just being still for that long alone helps a lot. Okay, we need to be still. We need to listen to God, and He knows what we need. We need to be still before the Lord. I think we need to listen to God. I think let me talk for myself. I've been brought up, I think, in prayer to speak only and not to listen. So it's about me and not really giving God a chance to speak. And I do hope to see God in a powerful ministry. And that'll come. I mean, that's part of what God wants. But I think in terms of character change and transformation, the quiet times with God are really important for us. Okay, and I think God works inside of us. He is restoring us in the image. That is an internal work, inside out, and it's not always loud, not always visible, not immediately visible. It takes time, patience, And it takes extended times and repeated times of quietness. Sabbath rests. Daily, weekly, Sabbath rests, absolutely essential. We haven't concentrated enough on that. But then extended rests as well, like the festivals. God knew that his people needed to come together. And it was for a week or 10 days. Stop your normal work, get together, have fellowship, be in community, praise and worship me. Daily, weekly, and longer term Sabbath rests. I think that's the message we get out of that. Sorry?
Road trip.
Road trips, yeah, that sort of thing.
Yeah.
Yeah. Church camps, weekends away, all that stuff's so important. All right, so Elisha. So Elisha was a disciple. He was the son of Elijah. He was with there when Elijah was taken up into heaven in chariots, horses of fire, 2 Kings 2. And then he asked Elijah for a double portion of his spirit. How do you guys understand that? Elisha, according to the miracles that are recorded, because remember Elijah and Elisha prophesied over 50, 60, 70 years. I think they did a lot more than 20 miracles in that time. But the examples that the author of Kings decided to choose, it so happens that Elisha did more or less double the amount. I came across 8 and 16. You'll even find one with 15 and 30, etc. So it's kind of, I don't think that's what he's talking about. But in that culture, to get a double portion was about inheritance. Who inherited double the amount of everybody else, all the siblings? The older son. Okay. And we think, oh, that's so unfair. But the older son was responsible for taking care of his siblings.
Yeah.
He needed more resources to do that. He was responsible for maintaining the family property. You need budget for that. Okay. And so I think, Elisha is saying to Elijah, because Elijah would have had other disciples or proteges in that culture. Elisha says, let me be the oldest son. Let me take your name forward. Give me responsibility. Okay. So you go to your disciple and you say, I want a double portion of your spirit. What you're saying is, let me take over your ministry one day. Okay. I'm responsible to do it. Elisha, Naaman, look, there's so many. I'm just going to share this. I love the story of Naaman. You guys know the story? Probably Naaman was the head of the army of Syria. Yeah, this is an important guy, right? He's the general of the army, and he lives in Assyria, north of the northern kingdom. And what they used to do in those days was to have cross-border raids, and I'm sure this happened between all the nations. I don't know, like a strike force, send the guys in at night or something and grab some people, slaves and property, and go rushing back. Okay, they had these raids, ambushes and raids. And a young Israelite, a young girl we talk about, was taken in one of these raids, and she ended up in the home of Naaman, serving Naaman's wife. Okay. Now, one day I am going to do a series on unnamed heroes in the Bible. And this little girl is on top of the list. Think about it. She's probably never going to see her family again. Okay. And she is still interested in the health of Naaman. He has leprosy, and she's got away with the mistress, whatever, the wife, and says to her, please, my master Naaman, if he would only go and speak to Elisha. Spreading the gospel, right? If I can connect him with Elisha here. Isn't that an awesome heart? Yes, she's an amazing woman, little girl probably. So Naaman, commander of the army of the king of Syria, 2 Kings 5, was a great man with his master and in high favor, because by him the Lord had given him victory to Syria. Always a message in Kings, right? He was an amazing guy. But the Lord, remember, gave Syria victory, used by God to work things out. He was a mighty man of valor, but he was a leper. Now, the Syrians, on one of their raids, had carried off a little girl, as I said, from the land of Israel. She worked in the service of Naaman's wife. And then she said to her mistress, would that my Lord Naaman were with the prophet who is in Samaria, he would cure him of his leprosy. Talk about sharing your faith. So Naaman went down. No, not going to jump there. This is amazing what happened now. I'm paraphrasing. So Naaman ends up, and they go into detail. He goes down with some soldiers, and would have been a lot of soldiers. And the detail is he's got 10 changes of clothing. This guy wants to look good. I mean, he's kind of cruising, riding down. You can imagine him in his battle regalia, his armor with his beautiful helmet, and he wants, I'm the commander, with all of the, soldiers around him and, supply chain. So he ends up outside Elisha's home. And this is classic. You guys must read this, but I can imagine it. So he's waiting, and he sends his messenger to call Elisha out. Elisha says, just tell him to dip in the Jordan 7 times, it'll be good. So his messenger comes out. And David says, no ways, I haven't come here for that. He expected Elisha to come out and wave his hand and call on the mighty name of his Lord and cure me of his leprosy. He's not getting treated as he thinks he should be treated. Okay, good lesson for him. So he turns around and he starts going north again. But a few people, advisors, convinced him, no, let's just calm down, master. Maybe there's something in this. So he goes back and he does dip himself 7 times. This is some competition. So he did go down and he dipped himself 7 times in the Jordan. This is pretty humbling, I mean, the guy's he's got his fancy clothes, takes off everything down to his underclothes, and he's got in front of all of these people go and dip himself in the Jordan. Good for him. And his flesh was, according to the word of the man of God, his flesh was restored like the flesh of a little child, and he was clean. Then he returned to the man of God and all the company, and all his company. Sorry, maybe sent the company off. And he came and stood before him. This is Elisha. And he said, this is Naaman speaking, behold, I know that there is no God in all the earth but in Israel. Wow, what repentance, eh? Man, he comes from this, he has worshipped dozens of gods. There's a God for everything. And he knows, like, the Ahab, people learned when Baal failed that, my gods can't do this. This is evidence, this is proof that this is, the one true God. Then he says, behold, okay, I know that there's no God in all the earth but in Israel. May the Lord pardon your servant, though. He says to Elisha, now may the Lord pardon your servant. I've got to go into the house of Rimmon, to worship. This is kind of what's expected of me. I've got to accompany the king, leaning on my arm, and I bow myself in the house of Rimmon. And when I bow myself in the house of Rimmon, the Lord pardon your servant in this matter. So he's already looking ahead. He recognizes that, Yahweh is the one true God, but he's going to have to accompany, the king. But he's going to be there, but he's not really going to be there. Is that okay? And Elisha, I love the answer. Now, what would you and I say? Probably shouldn't go there, Don't go and plant a church. Stay with disciples. Do this, do it. Elisha says, go in peace. It's like, God's got this, just go in peace. My wife, amazing. Have you known Aline? She's, one might have heard of her, but she baptized 7 years before me, and in Cape Town, 33 years ago. And she was sent back to PE pretty much like this. I mean, she was coming back to her husband, who was a pagan, pretty much. Came back and told me that she's, had this sort of experience, almost like a Naaman leper experience. She's been saved and cleansed and cool. Oh, that's interesting. What does this mean? And I gave her a hard time for 7 years, man. But the message they gave her was just go in peace, and they supported her with material, and the church grew. The church in PE grew. It was amazing. Sometimes, and obviously we've got to be wise. Sometimes, we don't have to try and solve all the problems. God's got this. Go in peace, we'll pray for you, we'll be in touch, etc. Great story. Sure. Naaman showed a lot of humility. I mean, he rode into, the little village, pretty prideful, right?
Yeah.
Like, why do I have to go to myself in the stinking river? I got better rivers back home. That's what he said, literally. But you sense humility, and he's asking Elisha, is it okay? This is what I got to do. I need to do it. He's thinking ahead already. So yeah, great point. Yeah, there's a change. in the waters, any sort of memory, any sort of echoes of baptism, Is this our attitude after coming out of the waters of baptism? We're arrogant going in, but coming out, we have this sort of humility and faith. Okay, the point here, I could have added, what lessons can we learn from the little girl? She was somehow familiar still with what was going on. Maybe it was fresh in her memory. Maybe she hadn't been here very long. But yeah, she knew to connect him with Elijah, this great man, prophet, and healer. Yeah. And what I haven't included here is the little passage explaining how Naaman collected soil. And he asked Elisha, is it okay? I'm just going to take the soil with me. Okay, he hasn't quite got it yet, right? He's got to learn quite a bit still. The guy's, you can say, repented and he's humble. But the belief in those days was that gods were very local. They were limited to countries. And when you crossed a border, you left that god behind and suddenly you took on the new god. And they believed that taking some of the soil with them, you were taking God with them. So he's got a bit to learn still, but hey, man, it's very, he'll learn. Of course, Elijah, so I'll take some soil, that's good. Okay, so let's move on. Okay, there's and I'm not going to go into the details here, but so many echoes of John and Jesus in the stories of Elijah and Elisha. A few years, we know Malachi, there was a prophecy that someone will be sent as a way to prepare the way for the Messiah. And Malachi said, I will send you Elijah, and he will turn the hearts of the fathers to their children, the hearts of the children to their fathers. So many people in that time believed that Elijah, who remember left before dying, I think the only example was somebody who actually went to be with God without dying. They believed that he would physically come back. Okay. Now, Matthew 17, this is where Jesus is explaining something to his disciples. His disciples have now seen Elijah. Now they're a bit confused. Has he come back? What's cutting? And then Jesus says, but I tell you that Elijah has already come. And they did not recognize him, but did to him whatever they pleased. So they speak about John the Baptist. Remember, they chopped off his head. There's so many similarities between Herod and an evil wife, how they treated John and how they wanted to treat Elijah. It's just so many amazing sort of correlations. Jesus says, so also the Son of Man will certainly suffer at their hands. Then the disciples understood that he was speaking to them of John the Baptist. Okay, so Elijah was a precursor of Elisha. John the Baptist was a precursor of Jesus. But then, John now is in prison, maybe having a slight Elijah moment here, a bit fearful, a little bit of doubt, are things as I think they are. And then we, John in prison says this. He'd heard about Jesus. He sent words by his disciples. They said to him, are you the one who is to come, or shall we look for another? And Jesus answered them, go and tell John what you hear and see. The blind receive their sight and the lame walk. Lepers are cleansed and the deaf hear. And the dead are raised up and the poor have good news preached to them. This is pretty good summary of the miracles and the mission of Elisha. So Jesus is saying that, yep, the one who Elisha was pointing forward to is here, that's me. Amazing. Yeah, the one who is to come is here. So he references back to what Elisha did. Elijah is John the Baptist, Elisha is Jesus. So it's amazing. It builds my faith when I study this stuff out. I don't know about you, but they're pointing forward. They are prefigures and types of John the Baptist and Jesus. Okay, so a few other similarities here. Elijah and John the Baptist, they're both known for their unusual style of dress. Clothes made from hair, kept together by a leather belt. Both faced hostile kings throughout their lives. I mentioned that. The main antagonist for both was a woman. Jezebel, and the Herodias was Herod's sister-in-law who he had an affair with, basically. Put it kindly. I think it was a family member Herod's, something like that. Anyway, but definitely not someone who you should have been associating with intimately, but he was. Both anointed their successors in the Jordan River. So Elijah was the forerunner of Elisha for Elisha, just as John was for Jesus. Okay, so they are types of John the Baptist and Jesus.